Today we're going to paint a sweet and simple fall floral bouquet using loose watercolor techniques. This one is perfect for beginners, and I'll share the entire process step by step in real time so you can follow along with me easily. Let's get started. All of the supply links are down below in the description box, so if you're ever curious what paint, paper, and brushes I'm using throughout the video, be sure to take a look down there. Alright, so I have my watercolor paper, and you might see some faint pencil marks on here. This isn't a project where you have to sketch anything out. I just added a faint little stem just so I could remember which direction and flow I want this bouquet to be. But don't worry about having to sketch anything. So I want this bouquet to be curving, and I want it to have some good movement to it. And if you're familiar with my other tutorials, you know I like to work with my big primary elements first and then work my way smaller and smaller. So I want to have the biggest element be a blooming rose right around here on the middle left area of the page. So I'm going to make that a beautiful kind of moody pink-red color, which is a mixture of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake. It's a color that I've been using in a lot of my fall tutorials. I have a good amount mixed up in my palette, and I have a little bit more of the Quin Lake than the Quin Sienna just to give it more of a pink purple hue, more so than the red. And we're going to start by painting the rose. So it's the same technique I've done in several of my tutorials, so you might be familiar with it, but I start with the tip of my brush and I start very pigmented. And I gently add in some little dainty C curves. So these are little strokes like this that are in the shape of a C. And I'm leaving some white space in between each stroke as I add it, which will help give these petals some definition. So just working my way around, and these strokes are getting slightly bigger. And while they're still wet, I'll go ahead and rinse off my brush and feather some of these out. And when I say feather out, I'm just using clean water in my brush and lining the outer edges, just like this, to start blending out that color a bit. And when I paint roses, I start very dark in the center and then get lighter and lighter as I add the outer petals, and the outer petals also get bigger and bigger. So I'm using a much more diluted mixture at this point, and I'm allowing the belly of my brush to really expand out on the page like this to create bigger, fluffier petals. Making sure to leave that white space there in between. And then I'm going to go back in, this is my favorite part of loose roses, going back in with some of that deep dark pigment and tapping it in along the inner edges of some of these light petals. And because we have that water that's still activated there, the pigment is blooming out into the petal. So this is looking good for the main section of the rose, but now I want to add some skirting petals to really give it that full bloom effect. So I'm going to use that same pigment, and I'm going to start adding some light value petals coming off of this main section of the rose. So instead of doing C curves, I'm adding falling petals like this, starting with the tip of my brush and then pushing down to create these big petals. And you can be loose and quick, and you'll see I often go back in with that dark pigment and tap it in to really make sure I get a bold, vibrant contrast. I usually just tap it into the very center, right where I add those connecting petals, so you get that really beautiful effect. I'm going to add a few more here, and as I work my way around adding these skirting petals, I start to curve them to follow the shape of the rose. So they're not all going to stick straight out. They're kind of following that circular shape. Same for this side. It's not pulling straight out, it's starting to curve. And you can see, because I'm using a mixture of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake, some of the petals are a little more purpley, some have a little bit more of a red shade. So it's making this rose look very dynamic. So I'm just going to add one final little one here on the side. And maybe a little guy up here So that's looking good for the main rows, and now we can work on some of the smaller elements. So I already have a good amount of that same color still in my brush and still activated on my palette. So I want to do one more main flower with this color and then a couple little fillers. So let's add a flower down here on the bottom right. Again, I want this overall shape to be curving like this. So I want to keep that in mind, but I do want a little flower coming off on the side here. And for this one, I'm going to use the technique I often do for simple flowers, which is starting very pigmented, tapping in some basic dots, just like that, and then rinsing off my brush and using clean water to create some flower petals. So I start with the tip of my brush, pull out, push down, and create a petal. And I'm going to do that all the way around this flower. So I have clean water in my brush, but because these center dots are so heavily pigmented, I can pull that color out for the rest of the petal. And let's do more of a horizontal petal for this bottom one to change it up a bit. And then I'll go in once more with dark pigment and really deepen the very center of these petals to get that beautiful bold contrast. Now I'm going to switch over to my cadmium yellow deep. This is another great color I like to use in my fall tutorials. And we're going to do a similar flower to this, but up here at the top area, and then we'll move on to the fillers. So these 3 flowers will kind of be the primary ones, and then we'll just add a couple fillers, a couple leaves, and call it good. So for this one, I'm going to tap in those very pigmented dots, kind of in an oval shape like this, rinsing off my brush, and I'll do the same thing. Make sure you're using quick expressive strokes when you add these petals. You don't have to worry about making them perfect or making all the petals the exact same. And also as you do this, if any of your dots start to dry up and you don't have enough to pull from, you can simply reactivate it, add more pigment in, and then continue adding your petals. So you can see I'm making some of them slightly bigger, some are thin and wispy, and just keeping it very unique. Now I'm actually going to darken some of these petals. They're a little bit too light compared to these guys, so I'm going to go over it with a little more of the cadmium yellow. Just deepen that value a little bit. And one thing I like to do to make these lighter flowers pop is I add a little bit of this bold mixture into the very center. So I don't want a whole lot of pigment or water in my brush. I don't want it to flood this entire flower, but I do want to help that center of it pop. So I'm loading up this same color, which is Quin Lake and Quin Sienna, and using the very tip of my brush, I'm going to gently tap some of that into the very center. And because those petals are still slightly wet, it'll generate a very gentle bleed. So you can see this pink is not overtaking. I'm being careful with my water control. It's remaining right there in the center, but you're getting a very minimal bleed there. That gives it just a beautiful effect in my opinion. So that's going to be it for the main flowers. Remember, keep that shape in mind. So we're going to want to add some fillers up here. And since I have this cadmium yellow in my brush, that's what I'm going to use. Loading up some of that color, and I'm going to start with a pretty light value, so it's kind of watered down. And when I add fillers to my pieces like this, I oftentimes just make simple 1 or 2 petal shapes, and that's about it. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm pushing down and creating this almond shape as I normally do with my flower petals. And then I'm going to do a similar one right next to it, kind of coming off to the side. So they almost look like little leaves, but they're petals, and that's going to be a filler flower. Let's do some more. Same color loaded up. I'm going to do a little bit to the right, pulling down, creating these unique little shapes. You can be loose, you can add some dainty little marks coming off of it if you want. Just be expressive with it, and you can add more of these too if you want. But I just like to tap these in, and then at the very base, I tap in some of the very dark pigment to give it kind of a gradient from light to dark. And we'll do the same thing with a couple more fillers over here on the right side. So taking my Quin Sienna, Quin Lake mixture, you can of course use other colors if you want. And I'm going to do the same thing, making quick little loose bud shapes. You can see oftentimes I just make little marks like that to add some character. And let's add a couple more dainty little guys coming off of here. I'm just making shapes. I'm not making perfect petals. I'm not making leaves. Just kind of tapping my brush down to get these unique little fillers. While they're still wet, I'll tap back in some of that dark pigment. And this is my favorite part of loose style painting, is getting those soft, gentle blends. So let's start with that for now. Our bouquet still has a curve to it. You can't necessarily see it right now, but that's what we're going to add in with our stems and our leaves. So for my greenery, any shade of green is fine. I'm using a bit of green gold mixed with Payne's gray. That's just what I have in my palette right now. I don't often use green gold, but I find when I mix it with something deep and dark like Payne's gray, it makes a really beautiful dark green shade. And I want to do 2 layers overall of greenery. And when we do layers, we work from light to dark. So I'm starting with a fairly light value, and I'm using the tip of my brush. And I'm just going to lightly paint in the shape of the stem. I'm not worrying about adding leaves at this point or anything else. I just want to get that shape in place so that then that'll inform me of where are the best places to add the rest of the stem, the leaves and the little embellishments. So I'm not making any lines that are too perfectly straight. I always want to make my leaves and stems with a little bit of curve. I like to make sure, first of all, that everything is connected. So you can see every flower is connected in some way. And then I go through and just use light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure to add in some leaves. I like to usually have a couple coming out of the top of some flowers. I like to do wispy little strokes with the tip of my brush, but this is where you can really let your creativity and your artistic intuition flourish, because there's not one specific way that you have to do this. You can add as many or as few as you want. You can add some more fillers too. If you get to this point and you think that you maybe have somewhere that looks a little bit too empty, or you want to add something here or there, by all means you can do that. But I really just like to place all those elements first, make sure I like the shape, make sure everything's connected, and then you can decide if you want to add things or if you want to add more colors or flowers or anything you want. So that's kind of my process that I like to stick to, is starting big, getting my shape in there, and then adding embellishments. And when I add the finishing touches, I really like to go dark. So I'm adding quite a bit of Payne's gray to my mixture, and you can see how bold and deep that color is now because there's a lot of Payne's gray mixed in with the green gold. So just going to add a few more of these. Some of them are leaves, some of them are wispy little strokes. Sometimes I'm just darkening that stem that we have already included. I usually like to have quite a few leaves coming out of the largest element too, which is this rose. So I'll add a couple leaves coming directly out. And make sure you're varying where you add these embellishments. I don't want to have it all on the left side or all on the right side, or I don't want it to be too top heavy and be empty on the bottom. You really want to keep balance in mind as you do this. So I'm making sure to spread things out. I'm always having a good amount of movement in my brush strokes. And let's add a couple little guys coming out of this yellow flower on the top. And I think that is good for the leaves and greenery. I do want to deepen some of the contrast in the filler flowers. So as you know, watercolor always dries a bit lighter than when you first apply paint down on your paper. So sometimes what looks beautiful while you're painting and bold and contrasted starts to kind of get washed out looking a little bit when it dries. So I oftentimes like to just go back in. I'm going to re-wet that surface a little bit. And then I'm going straight into my cadmium yellow deep. I'm re-tapping that back in. So just kind of bringing back some of that vibrancy that was lost when everything dried. So you can re-wet it and let it bleed like that, or you can just go straight in and do some wet on dry for these final little embellishments. But this is something that I love to do on my paintings to make sure everything's looking bright and vibrant and bold. I love having a strong contrast between light and dark values, especially in loose florals like this. If everything's the same value, it can be easy to look a little bit flat or cartoony. But when you have some contrast like this from light to dark, that's what just gives it that very elegant and romantic feel to it. So go ahead and add any final details that you want. Like I said, you can always make your own variations to a piece like that, like this. And that's what I love about this project, is you can add any sort of flowers you want. If you don't want a rose here, you can do tulips. You can add some little lavender if you want. You can add different types of leaves or maybe some eucalyptus. But this arrangement is something that's really fun. It always looks beautiful, and it's a quick and easy project. I hope you liked painting this fall floral bouquet with me today, and if you're interested in mastering loose watercolor florals, especially floral compositions, I know those can be tricky, I would really encourage you to take a look at my 15-day floral composition challenge. It is my latest class that's available on Skillshare and also on my website, and that class takes you through 15 unique floral projects in a very approachable step-by-step format. So I linked all of that information down below as well. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next video.